This story happened on the bleak night of November 14th, 1995, in Beijing, China. An old man, some say an old woman, was waiting at a bus stop at midnight, making conversation with the only other person at the stop, a quiet, young gentleman. When the midnight bus 375, the last bus for Route 375, from the Yuan Minghuan bus terminus, finally came, they both boarded it. The old man took a seat near the front of the bus, while the young man sat a couple of rows behind him. There were no other passengers along with them, except for the driver and a female ticket collector. After a while, the driver spotted two shadows by the side of the road, waving at the bus. He stopped, and when the doors opened, three people got on. Two men who were supporting a third between them, holding him up by his shoulders. The man in the middle looked disheveled, and his head was bowed so that nobody could see his face. There was a dismal, calm atmosphere inside the bus. Shortly after that, the old man picked a fight with the young man under some silly pretense of stealing his wallet. The altercation escalated, and the bus driver forced them both off the bus. When they got off and the bus zoomed away, the old man was no longer angry. He told the young man that he had saved their lives. Those three new passengers did not have feet. They were floating. They were not living people, he said. After that, they went to the nearest police station to report what had happened, but nobody believed them. The very next day, the bus company issued a statement. Last night, the final bus of Route 375 vanished, along with the driver and ticket lady. The police immediately chased down the old man and the young man, who were initially assumed to be mentally ill when they tried to report the incident earlier. They were both interviewed on the news. On the third day, the police discovered the missing bus in a water reservoir about 100 kilometers away from its destination, Xiangshan, or so-called Fragrant Hills. Inside the bus were three very badly decomposed corpses. The mysteries surrounding this finding included the fact that the bus did not have enough petrol to go that far after a whole day's worth of travel. The fact that the petrol tank was filled with fresh blood instead of fuel. The fact that the corpses found were too decomposed for just 48 hours. Even if it was summer, the process of decomposition would not be this quick. An autopsy confirmed that there had been no intentional meddling with the bodies. The fact that, even after the police went through all the security cameras set up around the various entrances to the reservoir, they found nothing out of ordinary. To this day, it remains an unsolved mystery. I first heard about the bogeyman when I was 5. My parents used to treat him like a ghost story. If you don't be good and finish all your supper, the bogeyman is going to come and take you away from us. In retrospect, that was probably one of the most frightening things you could have ever told a 5-year-old. That a strange man will kidnap you away from your friends and family and everyone you love just because you weren't behaving. Parents can be cruel, but now that I think about it, it worked. So what can I say? They must have known what they were doing. Now I tell my children the same thing. The bogeyman is coming if you don't eat your peas. My daughter hates it. My son, on the other hand, wants to meet the bogeyman. "Daddy, Daddy, what does he look like?" he asks. That's the funny thing about it all. My parents never told me. They didn't have to. I was too afraid at the simple mention of his name that I didn't even want to know what he looked like. So I made it up. "Well," I said, "he's tall, really tall. And he wears a big black gas mask that covers his whole face, and it has big round eyes, like a bug. He wears a shiny black uniform, as black as you can imagine, and a long black cape." "Like a superhero?" my son asks. "No, like a supervillain. Underneath that mask and all that armor, the bogeyman is full of burns and scars. They say he can simply walk through fire and feel no pain, but that his body can still be burned." "Where did he come from?" "Nobody knows. All we know is He only shows up to little boys and girls who don't listen to their mommies and daddies and takes them away. Did he ever take you? My son asked. Almost, I said. I had to spice up the conversation somehow. I was a very naughty boy, so one night when I was sleeping, the bogeyman showed up and tried to take me away. But Grandma and Grandpa rushed into my room and begged the bogeyman not to take me from them. What did he do? What he always does. He told them, "I have come for your child, he who has disobeyed you. He will be mine for eternity." And Grandma cried and begged and told the bogeyman to give me one more chance. And the bogeyman looked at her and said, "He has but one chance left, and then he is mine." And the next thing I know, I wake up the next morning. And ever since then, I've tried to be the best that I can be. "I don't want the bogeyman to take me, Daddy," he said to me. In fairness, I shouldn't joke. What I, and many others, use to keep our children obedient isn't a joke or some kind of scary bedtime story. It's real. And when I got older, I realized this. But I would also realize that this bogeyman would come to be known by many names. Moreover, that my plucked-out-of-thin-air description of him was eerily accurate. Or at least, I thought I had made it up. It wasn't until some time later when I realized that I had actually seen the bogeyman before. Only at that time, I knew him by another name. I was 10, maybe 12. To be honest, I try not to think about that time any more than I have to. The Vietnam War had just ended, and my father had come back home. When I say he told some of the most horrific stories I have ever heard, you have to believe me. But there was one he told me that I'll never forget. There's no way I ever could. He saw the gasman, that's what he called it, right there on the battlefield, just a week before. I remember my father as he was telling it, the look in his eyes and the sound of his voice. I'd never seen him so terrified. The gasman, he was just standing there in the fires, watching. My father was in the trenches with other soldiers. No one else saw it, but my father. He swears. And if you had seen his eyes, I'm telling you, he was not lying. So my father, he watched the gas man. He couldn't look away like an accident or a crime scene. There's something about destruction and terror that's just so hypnotic. The gas man wasn't moving, wasn't saying anything. Right then, my father looked away, looked down, and he was alone. Everyone was gone. The noise was gone. His unit vanished. The enemy nowhere in sight. My father swears that in that moment, he thought he had died and gone to heaven. That somehow, when sticking his head up out of those trenches to look at the goddamned gasman, a bullet had gone right through his skull. But before he knew it, he was lying in a hospital bed a couple of days later, and the war was over. Those other men in the trench with him, no one found them. No bodies, no dog tags. They were just gone. And of course, no other reports of the gasman. What my father saw, he swears by, and I believe him. But those 4 men, they were real. They damn sure existed. But one day they were here, and the next. You might be asking, what was he doing on the battlefield? Isn't it a child's story? The gasman doesn't just care about children. People tell stories to make themselves feel better. People embellish. People romanticize, fantasize, lie. The gasman has been around for longer than you know. That very night after my father told me his story, I was in my bed, right there on the edge of sleep, when I saw him. The gasman appeared right before my eyes. More peculiar still, he was accompanied by 4 other men in uniform. I told my father the next day about this, and he was sure those were his men, the soldiers that went missing. So why did they all appear to me? Why did the gasman come to visit me? To warn me? Despite what your parents made you fear about the gasman, the bogeyman, the things that go bump in the night, he is not a threat. Don't misunderstand me. The gasman is a terrible omen. You do not want to see him. But he himself is not the threat. What the gasman represents is a sign of things to come. He is a deliverance. When you see him, it is the calm before the storm. 2 weeks later, my father died of respiratory failure. Carbon monoxide leak, they said. He tested positive for lethal amounts. But they check at the house, nothing. Not a trace. But you think the gasman is a petty nightmare, a poor man's ghost story. On March 16th of 1988, the genocide of up to 5,000 Kurdish people took place at the behest of Saddam Hussein on the city of Halabja in southern Kurdistan. A mix of different chemicals and compounds were used in the bombings. Following the events, one of the participants willingly came forward and gave himself up. He was babbling incessantly, asking to speak to a reporter. He gave a rather blunt account of the events from his own perspective. I was one of the pilots. I remember receiving the order. I remember the takeoff. I remember dropping the bombs. And I remember landing. But when we were sent off at the start of our mission, there were 5 people with me. When we landed, there were 6. I don't know who that 6th person was. I had never seen him in my life. And after that day, I never saw him again. He dressed like us, but never said a word. He wore a gas mask like I'd never seen before, more classical in design. Very primitive, very basic. The strangest part? All the other pilots had the exact same story. 5 men entered, 6 came off. We weren't all going crazy, were we? People called local police stations saying they saw the gasman in their backyard. It was the next big thing. People wanted the attention, wanted in on the craze, to be a part of a worldwide phenomenon in the making. Nobody really knew what they were talking about. Legends of the gasman date far back before most of our recollections. But that's the funny thing about myths. Over time, they change. They adapt to the trends. It's like a game of telephone. You start with a message on one end, and by the time you get to the opposite, the person thinks you're insulting them. Reports of mysterious gas-masked figures date back as early as the 1600s in Rome, when plague doctors would come around to treat those afflicted. They wore bizarre beak-like masks and carried with them an assortment of antidotes and potions. Perhaps they took their inspirations from the gasman, or perhaps art imitates life. Further still, the concept of the miasma was given to us by ancient Greece, which is described as a contagious power that has an independent life of its own. Until purged by the sacrificial death of the wrongdoer, society would be chronically infected by catastrophe. Is this the birth of the gasman, or just cause and effect? No one will ever really know. Throughout history, sightings of the gasman have been reported all over the world. In Italy, they call him Il Fantasma. In Japan, he is thought to be one of the Tengu, a type of legendary creature found in Japanese folk religion. Even one of the most devastating periods in human history has been attributed to him. The Black Death that spread all across Europe throughout the mid-14th century. Even recently, the gasman has been spotted. In February 2014, the Ukrainian Revolution took place after many violent riots in the capital city of Kyiv. You've seen the news, you know the story. I won't educate you on the details. But throughout this tumultuous time, there was one constant and recurring question. Who is the gasman? Pictures of a shrouded, masked figure spread like wildfire across the internet. Stories were created about this mystery man, often seen standing before burning buildings or amidst plumes of smoke. Why here? Why now? Why ever? Well, it's as I've told you before. The gasman is a harbinger. He is not a threat. He only warns of one. Quite frankly, I have no idea what's about to happen. I can't exactly explain the feeling one gets when you see the gasman for yourself, which is what makes this all the more insane. But I promise you, the gasman is real. And if he ever comes to visit you or your family, well, I don't believe in God, but I will pray for you. Because nothing good ever comes from a visit from the gas man. There has been a lot of discussion surrounding the mysterious footage of the so-called night crawler. I grew up in the Fresno area of California, and for many years had no handle on a terrifying teenage experience that haunts me to this day. It began in 1993, when 3 friends and I decided to spend an autumn night in the woods near Millerton Lake. It was the perfect conclusion to an amazing summer, and something we had planned for so long, but always found a way to put off. We walked aimlessly by the lake for hours, skipping stones, fishing, and enjoying the warmth of the quickly fading sunlight. The warmth soon disappeared behind the treetops, and we decided to walk a little further into the undergrowth to find a good spot to set up camp for the night. Alex and I set up the tent while Terrence began collecting wood for a campfire. We had beer, meat, and all the necessary components for a long night's supply of s'mores. The cold autumn night air soon enveloped our campsite, and crickets began to sing as the smoky scent of the steak we were cooking drifted through the trees and up into the clear night sky. As we finished off the last of the beer, we noticed that we had slightly underestimated the amount of wood needed to keep a fire going, and so I decided to hunt around for some dry logs and branches. I paced around the campsite but couldn't find anything more substantial than a couple of twigs, so I decided to grab a flashlight and leave the safety of our enclosure out into the wall of darkness surrounding us. It became clear that this forest had experienced a run on fire-building materials, because for the life of me, I could not find anything big enough to justify carrying it back to camp. I didn't think I had wandered far when I heard a rush of air behind me. I turned around and saw the leaves on the forest floor twirling in the beam of my flashlight, a small dust devil perhaps. But as I fixed my gaze ahead of me and back towards the campsite, I noticed that things were not quite right. I hadn't walked more than 200 meters, and yet I couldn't see any glow of a fire whatsoever. I began to feel incredibly uneasy at the implication that I had somehow wandered further from the campsite than imagined, and was now lost in these ominous woods, alone. I managed to collect myself and began retracing my steps. The sameness of every direction was disconcerting. However, I could see impressions in the dirt of where I had previously walked. So I followed intently, knowing that I would soon see the glowing orange light of the fire and the welcoming silhouettes of my friends by a tent. The more I walked, the more I began to feel that things were not right. I was still following the trail of my footsteps, and yet somehow, after 5 minutes of walking, I was no closer to the campsite. I knew I had not walked for this long on my way out here. I stopped, feeling the need to crouch down and consider the situation, before fear began to take hold. I looked around and began to notice that the trees around me felt strangely distant and faint, almost as if they were shrouded in a dark mist. This wasn't a physical mist, but rather something ominous that had somehow cloaked the forest in darkness. This wasn't just the darkness of night, but beyond that, you could feel it. I stood up, however, and logic prevailed as I continued along the long path of my footsteps. In the distance, I could see something familiar. I immediately picked up the pace, and as I got closer, I realized that it was the campsite, but there was no fire. The camp felt completely cold and empty. It seemed strange that the fire would have died out so quickly, but not beyond reason. I finally reached the tent, and that uneasy feeling I had managed to suppress quickly reappeared, as I realized that my friends were no longer there. I called out their names and shined my flashlight into the surrounding foliage, but there was no response. At this point, all semblance of composure left my body. I realized that they could have simply wandered off to try and find me, but I somehow knew that this was not the case. Call it sixth sense, if you will. I decided the only thing to do was to try to restart the fire with whatever fuel I could find. But no matter what I did, no flame would appear from my Zippo lighter. as if it too wanted to hide away from this overwhelming darkness. I sat down again with my head in my hands, racking my brain for an explanation of the events thus far. I began to feel the surrounding blackness scurry closer towards me, as if it knew that somehow the absence of fire had removed some protective force field from around the camp. The next thing I can recall is just being confronted by the most terrifying sound. It can only be described as an eerie whirring noise, almost like a tornado siren, but completely unnatural and unlike anything I have ever heard. Chills ran down my spine as I sat up to determine the source of this haunting sound. It seemed to reverberate throughout the tree trunks in all directions, as the breeze which had been ever present throughout the evening seemed to retreat almost instantly into silence. I heard footsteps and immediately rejoiced that my friends were returning to the camp and that we could discuss the night's events and at long last put myself at ease. As I listened to these footsteps drawing closer, I felt a sudden uneasiness as I realized that there was something very wrong with the sound. They were far too slow. It sounded as if someone was walking unnaturally leisurely, artificially, or alternatively, that they were on stilts. The more I listened to these footsteps, the more convinced I became that this was the sound of someone walking on stilts. And this thought really scared me, because after all, who or what would be walking on stilts in this pitch blackness in the thick of a forest? I shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound, dreading what I might see, but I had to know. The footsteps were closer than ever now. They must be right here, I thought. Suddenly, I see an object glint in the beam of light. The footsteps stop. At this point, I am absolutely frozen in terror as I glimpse a small white object through the trees. It moves slightly, and I see what looks like a head and legs. The head slowly turns towards me, and what I see causes me to scream, but no sound comes out of my mouth. The head is completely featureless. There are no eyes, no mouth, no nose, and no ears. And yet somehow I know that it is looking at me. It had no body, just a featureless head attached to long, sinewy legs, and must have been no taller than 4 feet. It slowly turned its face back to the direction in which it was traveling, as far as I could tell, and began its uncanny gait back into the darkness. I sat there, shaking and mumbling as I tried to console myself. I had no explanation for what I had just seen. Just as quickly as it had arrived, the ghostly darkness that had surrounded everything vanished, and the breeze returned to the trees. There they were, my friends, between the trees. I ran towards them, and they were shocked to see my expression. "What the hell is wrong?" Terrence shouted as I reached them. It seems they had heard something moving towards the edge of the lake and had gone to investigate, thinking it was me. It seems they too couldn't find their way back to the camp and had also found themselves trapped on some endless path to nowhere. I mentioned the sound, but they hadn't heard anything and had no idea how the fire had been extinguished, as it was still burning strong when they left. I told them about what I had just experienced, and Alex's facial expression turned to one of terror. He told me that Native Americans in the area had described seeing such creatures for generations, and that they often carried with them a sense of dread. We headed to the camp and noticed that all of our watches had stopped running, and so we had no idea of the time frame in which these events occurred. Needless to say, at this point, we didn't sleep a wink that night, but the rest of it was uneventful. We left hastily at dawn. For years I had wondered what these creatures were, and why this one felt the need to show up at our camp. All I had was this tale of Native American legend, and the fear that stayed with me since that night. It seems now that there is video evidence of these creatures venturing outside of the forest and into built-up areas. I can't help but wonder what it is that is drawing them closer to humankind, and just what it is that they may be planning. In the meantime, we will never know.